Hi, and welcome to another episode in the epic series SEO is a Yo. Today we're talking about how to get entities and their attributes into the knowledge graph. So it's kind of practical, but it's still going to be pretty theoretical. And we're going to try and kind of develop a conversation around this whole topic. Today we've got Sam Underwood, Andrew, I've put Optimizy because his real name is Cock Starkey, and David Amerland. I'm really happy to have you guys on board. We've had a quick chat about this before. I've been researching quite a lot for this one, and I've got some input from other people who have been on the series and who will be on the series. So it looks like it's going to be incredibly cool. We'll start with Andrew because he's on the left. Nice to meet you, Andrew. Lovely
Jason.
to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Delightful. I know a few things about you. Number one is you've got your meetup Optimizy, which you've built from nothing in a year to be something incredibly important.
Thanks very much.
Is that true?
It is true. So I run a free to attend SEO event in Cambridge in the UK. And I've been very lucky to have some amazing speakers, some of whom are featured in your series. So I'm feeling slightly intimidated by all the amazing people you've had on. But yeah, I do some SEO consultancy and I have a day job as well. So I work in-house in
Crumbs, yeah.
Cambridge.
Some of the guests I've got on board would only do it because they knew you and you said I was a nice guy, which is Lexi Mills being one of them. I also know that you're involved in, or you were involved in Marylebone Cricket Club.
True, yeah. I worked at Lord's. I had Lord's Cricket Ground as my office for a while. That was pretty spectacular.
Well, it was a real job. It wasn't just a hobby.
It was a real job. Although when I arrived there, there were some very small C conservative people that worked there who didn't really think they needed a website. So that's how long ago I worked there.
I would have thought they'd probably be big C conservative too, wouldn't they? In that area?
No comment. No comment.
Oh right, sorry, I'm allowed to say it. Yeah, no. But you do have a real job, but it's in house, yeah.
I do have a real job, yes, in house. The consultancy pays for some nice things, but not enough yet.
But from what I can see, it's in your house. It's not in house. I mean, I've got a job in my house.
I'm just in my house today.
Well, thank you for taking the day off work to join us today. Next on to David. I know you're incredibly international. I looked you up on the knowledge graph and you're a British journalist, but you're Greek American, Australian, Chinese, and South African. No, that's not it, is it?
Close enough. That was really funny, actually.
Yeah, you're an international kind of guy, and we've got Andrew, who's terribly British. I'm terribly British, but living in France, and you're incredibly international.
I am, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm Australian, but
I live in Britain.
Yeah, I live in Britain for a long time, and I kind of traveled a lot. And I'm in Greece at the moment, so I'm enjoying the weather.
And from what I understand, you write one book a week, and you sleep 17 hours a week in order to write a book a week. Is that right?
Well, I wish I could write a book a week. It takes me a long time to actually write one. So usually I have 2 or 3 on the go at the same time in terms of research, ideas, development, and sort of that fills up a lot of time. And
yeah, and when you finish the book, you then try and explain why you wrote it to somebody, and that makes you write another book.
That happened last night when I was discussing something with somebody. And
then the cycle continues. Every time you finish a book, you explain it to somebody and you think, oh, there's the next book.
Well, I wish it was that easy, but you're right. A book has to have a reason. And that reason usually has to be an answer to something specific. And if it doesn't do that, then it's just an indulgence.
Oh, okay. Well, I think you can allow yourself an indulgence or two. You've written loads of books. How many?
I've written 14 books to date, 10 of which are business books. Okay.
And the other 4 are children's books?
They're martial arts, health related.
Yeah, okay.
Health and fitness.
Yeah, we discussed that. You're big on martial arts, whereas I'm more into the music. Well, let's move on to Sam. Lovely to meet you. Thank you for coming along, David. I know you're going to have loads of things to say. Sam, delighted to meet you. My first meeting with you was yesterday. You work at Zazzle Media.
I do, yeah. No books. Strategy manager at Zazzle Media, yeah.
Yeah, and they've got an office in an underground tunnel at a railway station.
Yeah, that's it. You can kind of see the
I love the background. You just look so cool. I might get some taggers to come around here and do my back wall for next week.
Yeah, you got to do it.
And you are the first person I have ever met who has a degree from the Open University.
Yes, yeah. Well, still working on it, actually. Not quite got it yet, but yeah.
Who hasn't got?
Yeah, it hasn't got a degree from it. Yeah.
But how does that work? It was always that thing that I saw at 6 in the morning when I got up to watch the telly when my parents were still asleep, and I'd watch the Open University just because I was allowed to watch the telly.
So
is it 6 in the morning still?
No, it's actually, you kind of just do it all in your own time, just whenever you can do. Like, you don't actually even need to talk to anyone, you just get sent books. So
all right.
it takes a long time though, about 6 years the course, but yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, okay. So the wonders of modern technology mean that we no longer have to watch the TV. BBC Two it was, I think, at 6 o'clock in the morning to get the course from some guy with a really funny jacket on and silly long hair. Sorry, it shows that I grew up in the 70s. Right, so it's lovely to meet you all. I think we've got everybody pretty much on board. I know Simon Cox is around. So we can get right on with the episode. I'm particularly excited about this because I initially thought I'm really smart. I got myself my place in the knowledge graph by leveraging the fact that I was a musician and I'd made these cartoons. And then I started talking to lots of different people about how they do it, what it really means, how to get your company in. And I realized that I had it pretty easy. I mean, I was leveraging notable things that were easy to get myself into the knowledge graph. And cheating like that is fine, but it doesn't necessarily bring you the lowdown, the real information about how to do it. So we're going to look at that today with David, Andrew, and Sam. And we're going to start right off for once with a question. And this question is to David. For once, I'm not introducing, but you said this to me a couple of days ago, and I really liked it. In order to own the conceptual space where your company services, think in terms of semantic density. Can you explain it again?
Yeah, and that's really cool. And let's go back pre-semantic search days when the web was simpler and search was simpler, and our job was probably simpler, although it didn't feel like so at the time. And we used to think about keyword density, which is, in the worst case scenarios, a number of keywords, number of times a keyword would appear in a web document, which would help that document to surface in relation to a search query that contained that keyword. And it was as simple as that. And we go now to semantic search and semantic density. And the same simplicity of approach actually applies, but now it's infinitely more complex. So what do we mean by semantic density? Well, essentially, if we think that in order to surface in a relevant as a relevant answer to a search query in semantic search, we need to have some way of surfacing the credibility of the information that we provide in relation to that search. The only way of building that up is by building their presence as an entity in relation to that particular query. And the only way we can do that is by having the relevant information just about everywhere. So Google can actually see it and say, hey, what is it that this guy does? Sells used cars. He's the best second-hand car salesman on the web, and actually surface that in relation to a particular query. There are many different ways we can do that. And Google has actually given us a number of hints in terms of how it can be done. We mentioned domain authority in relation to a website. Now, Google has said on this, yes and no. Okay, if we take what Gary Illyes said in relation to that, he said that Google doesn't actually take domain authority as a ranking signal, and the same thing happened with John Mueller, I forgot his name for a minute, when he said the same thing about in relation to that. But then Google also has said that when it comes to a brand new page on the web which surfaces in relation to a website, they use a site-wide signal, which is essentially domain authority, to rank that particular web page. So mixed signals here. And if we go with our own Rater's guidelines, which are expertise, authority, and trustworthiness, they have to apply to semantic search context and in terms of the information. Yeah.
I have a question then. In fact, sorry, we're looking at you said web authority, the website authority. But if you have managed to link your brand, you've got your entity in the knowledge graph, and you've managed to explicitly get Google to say, right, this brand has this website. It's no longer a website authority; it's a brand authority we're talking about, which makes much more sense to me once you can understand it. Until they could understand brands or entities, they had to take websites because it was this thing that they could actually get a grip on. Exactly. Now they can get a grip on brands. If you've got that link, you're saying we're looking at brand authority, not website authority. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And essentially, the way we establish semantic density is by getting outside our own tiny website, which is essentially controlled by us, which makes it trustworthy, questionable. because we're bound to say the absolute best things about ourselves. And getting into the unstructured web, which is social media space, getting into structured databases, which contain factual information which has been independently verified or corroborated about us, getting into citations, getting into different publications and so on. So that's the kind of semantic density we're talking about. And there's two things about it. First of all, it's a lot of work. Second thing, it's a lot of work, there are no shortcuts. But if we don't do it, then we shouldn't have any expectation of search actually surfacing us in that context.
Okay. So in fact, three things. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work. And if you don't do it, nothing will ever happen. Sorry, I couldn't help it. But I've been working with clients on this, and this idea that you're saying, okay, I'm an expert in myself, but there's no reason for Google to trust me. However, if I can build up that my own trustworthiness, theoretically, if I've got enough corroboration about the information I've already fed Google, once I then say, okay, here's some new information, it should be much more easy for Google to accept that. So I become a trustworthy source about myself. Whereas right at the start, I'm not a trustworthy source. I'm just talking about myself, which is what I think people fail to understand, is they think, but of course I know about myself, but they don't realize that until they've convinced Google that they are actually telling the truth, they have no... Sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you're making a very important point here about convincing Google. And there's two things which I need to surface here. First of all is that because Google's algorithms are constantly changing and completely opaque, we always work in the dark. We sort of probe by doing something, reading the results and seeing if that works. So a lot of the stuff we work with is theoretical. At the same time, however, it's based on mathematics. And the mathematics it's based on is public knowledge. It's not the kind of thing that actually remains hidden. So if we look at graph theory, for instance, and look at how domain authority within that context is developed in graph theory, you need four things. You need the prestige of a website and its authors, and there are equations which give us that. The quality of the information which is presented. Again, there are mathematically assessed signals which give us that. The website centrality, which is basically the closeness of the importance of the website in a graph, in a knowledge graph in this particular case. And the last thing is the competitive situation around a subject. And that is, the more popular the subject, the greater the competition, the more people do it. So the harder it is for you to rise as an authority because of the noise and the similarity with everybody else. So if we take those four things essentially, which are not different to how we operate in the real world as flesh and blood entities, and we begin to translate them gradually into the digital domain, they can be broken down into practical steps, which can be applied at a sort of daily goal kind of daily task level, which will produce the same result. And to give an example, a concrete example of how this can happen, if we take the traditional marketing mix, which gives us product, price, place, and promotion for any kind of product, and if we then sort of equate that to the actions which we need to take at an SEO level, which would be solutions instead of product, access instead of price, value instead of place, and educational instead of promotion, then we suddenly have a template of what the content should be doing in any kind of platform, whether it's a website or in the social web or in a database. The moment it's accessed by an individual, in order for it to resonate, to have the desired effect in terms of their behavior, and to lead to the kind of signals from them that add to our credibility.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, I'm a big fan of the word credibility, and I think that's a really nice way to end that particular part. I mean, I've always talked about understanding of credibility, and I recently added relevance to make a three things in my list. Credibility is incredibly important, and I personally believe that you not only need to inform Google, fill the knowledge graph with factual information, it needs to be confident in that information, and it needs to see you as a credible source, because then you can move forwards and feed it more and more information, I would imagine, which I've had the example of with my own website, is that I see that when I feed it information, it tends to take it as truthful more quickly and with less persuasion. Although that isn't scientific, that's just me thinking. That's how it is. That's one example, which is why sitting on your own at home is not going to get you particularly well advanced. So next, in general, knowledge graphs can be created by manual curation, crowdsourcing, and semi-automatic extraction, or a combination of the three. I like that as a nice way of showing how we can build knowledge graphs. Manual curation, sorry, is obviously somebody coming up with a database, crowdsourcing something like Wikipedia. Automatic extraction is what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. The problems of extracting all this unstructured data in supposedly structured HTML pages. So this next question, sorry, goes to Sam. I've been very intrigued by the knowledge graph for years. Not 100% clear always what it is. Knowledge graph, knowledge vault. Give us the rundown to where we're at with that now today.
Sure. So obviously with the knowledge graph, it's kind of something people are more aware of. The knowledge graph being kind of this crowdsourced, open source knowledge base that Google's getting data from like Wikidata, a lot from Freebase, from when I think they're called MetaWeb. So that's kind of what the knowledge graph is kind of getting that information in a very structured way from Wikidata and Freebase and all those other ones. But the interesting thing with that is, kind of as you said, it's very human created. So there can be huge gaps in that knowledge. So as an example, in Freebase, for 71% of people in there, they've got no place of birth. For people also, 75% have no nationality assigned to it. And it's because, you know, if it's human created, it's very limited by the actual amount of manpower behind it. Whilst kind of the knowledge vault tries to fix that by collecting data in an unstructured way, you know, through things like scraping the web. Obviously, that's got its own issues with how factual that information actually is, but it's extracting things like facts using things like what's called RDF triples. So that's where it finds something on the web through something like the HTML DOM, for example, for a table, web text, annotations of like just a web page, and it's finding an RDF triple, which is where someone's making a statement about something. So you've got a subject, predicate, and an object. So something saying like, Obama is American, Bob is 30, any kind of statement like that about an actual entity. So it's kind of seeing those, but obviously on the web, anyone can go and say anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So what Google is actually doing here, or what they've spoken about doing is, with the knowledge vault, is kind of verifying that by all these different ways they can find that information, like the DOM, web tables, all those kind of things. And if they see the same thing over and over again on multiple different domains, they can kind of go, okay, well, this is more likely to be a fact, and they can go, well, we're 0.8%, you know, or 80% sure this is a fact. And if they see that multiple times across different domains, it's like, yeah, they're going to be more sure of that.
Yeah, I like the idea, sorry to cut in, but the knowledge vault is being built up by Google using its algorithms, using extracted data from the web, basically saying, okay, we can, if we have enough confidence in the information, or our understanding rather of the information and the trustworthiness of the site, start building data without it being human created. Then you immediately hit the question is, the more automatic it is, the less reliable it is likely to be. And then if they start building that too fast, which is one of the reasons I think Bill Sebald was complaining last week that Google isn't showing enough facts. And it's that if they push it forward too fast, get things wrong, the further they move forward, because their seed set has mistakes in it, it will get more and more wrong, faster and faster in a kind of extrapolating manner. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's the stat I've seen around it is around 16% of triples that it actually finds across the web. It's only 16% they're actually sure is actually true. So there's a huge amount where they're kind of they think it might be true, but they're not 100% sure. It's quite interesting. There's other ways they kind of verify it. So obviously they've got the knowledge graph and they've got that Wikidata and the Freebase and all that kind of information, so they can kind of look at what they've found unstructured across the web and almost they cross-verify and go, okay, well, it says this on this website. We've seen that in the knowledge graph and that those kind of entities are related, or you know, a statement is true. So we know this is more true, and as a result, maybe that website's also more trustworthy.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so you've got. I mean, incredibly important, this idea of cross verification, and then you just touched, as I cut into you there, the fact that the more you can provide information that turns out to be factual, the more you become a trusted source, and that could be a way in the future of measuring trustworthiness. I know that Andrew is going to talk later on about how to get into the knowledge graph, and I can see a couple of questions coming through from Simon and William, specifically from Simon about problems with names, people's names. So we're going to have Andrew talking about that in a moment. We're going to move on to the next question. Thank you for that reply. I've got here on my little screen on my site Kalicube.pro, I've got the Google API from the knowledge graph, and basically it just pings the API to see what comes out. And here I've done David Amerland. I could have done pretty much anything, but we know that he's a British journalist, but in fact he's Australian or maybe Greek or something else. So the knowledge graph is obviously pretty confused about that. He thinks he's British, although he might be, I don't know. With a relevancy score, which I find kind of intriguing, exactly what that means. And if anybody can really give me a good explanation, I would be interested. Please do go along to that. It's fun to play with. It's not particularly scientific, but it's fun to play with. And when you look in, you can see what Google's throwing back through its API, and you can get the ID. I was talking to Andrew the other day of looking that ID up in Google Trends to actually get the search volume for a specific entity as opposed to the keyword or the word, which could be ambiguous. Steps to the knowledge graph. I checked this out on the web and I found loads of articles. I actually looked at about 12 and then I got bored. But this is what basically comes out. It's use schema, get a Wikipedia page, add yourself to Wikidata, have a Google My Business, online press releases, which was the one I liked most because it's such it's like your own site, such a self-centered point of view that I can't see that having any real value. Use keywords in your About Us page, which seems a bit out of date, and get a Google Plus page, which is now out of date, but wasn't when they wrote it, I assume. So, Andrew, can you give us a route into the knowledge graph? Obviously, that's a bit more, what do you call it? More reasonable, more reliable, more intelligent than that?
You mean something a bit more straightforward than being a famous musician and writing books like you and David?
Brilliant, yeah.
The tip is everybody just go and write a book. The end.
Oh, brilliant!
So, yeah. No, so there are ways. Those things you covered. So schema and Wikipedia, and I know you've talked a lot about on the series to lots of other people who are far more informed than I am about those kind of things. But for the majority of us, we don't write books. We're not famous musicians, or haven't invented things that everybody knows about. So it's a little bit more difficult. So yeah, other than schema, Wikipedia and Wikidata, what are the other kind of things you can do? And it's the stuff that you've got to think about it in terms of like, what's Google trying to do? It's trying to serve up the best answer. So how does it know who you are and what you do and your associations? And you got to think about the ways that you can feed Google this kind of information. And it's pretty obvious if you look at what they're doing, like where they're going with this kind of stuff. So like things like Google My Business, you mentioned that. Yeah, of course, having one is important. But if you look at the stuff they've done with it recently, you can now start to list on there your services, you can list on there your products, you can list your voucher codes, you can list what offers you've got, you can list events that you're hosting and all those kind of things. Google is using that. Of course it is. It's like, you're feeding the machine and all this kind of stuff. Like people have kind of rebelled a little bit against schema because it's like, oh, well, if we just make the machine so intelligent that we're just going to kill ourselves, then we won't need anybody to do any information anymore. The machines will just run the world. But that's the data sets. That's where Google's getting this information. So yeah, there's lots of places you can feed other places and other information into it. Like you can use Bing and you can get yourself cited in the Better Business Bureau, which is really big in the States, but makes people like me in the UK completely scratch their head because we don't have the Better Business Bureau. What do we use instead? But it depends on your business, like TripAdvisor and Yelp. Of course, Google is scraping all this kind of stuff. And the biggest data source that Google has is us. So we do that kind of stuff when we're searching. If you're searching for, like, I know Simon's asked about this and he has this issue because he's got a very common name. So if you're searching for Simon Cox and you get 50 trillion results, and then you search again for Simon Cox footballer or Simon Cox SEO or Simon Cox, etc., then Google knows that too. It knows that when you searched for that and then you changed your mind and you said, actually, I don't want 50 million results. I'm just looking for that bloke that, does SEO, or I'm looking for the bloke that plays football. Google is associating those things. And so when you start to get those search terms related to your brand name, so if you have Optimizy, say, what the heck is Optimizy? Google doesn't know that. If you search for Optimizy SEO, then Google's starting to build a data source and start getting a set of things together that goes, okay, well, maybe these things go together. And then it's like the stuff Sam was saying. It doesn't just take your word for it. You can't just flood your website with Andrew is the best SEO in Cambridge. Of course he is. But you need other people to say it for you too. And you need that kind of corroboration, if you like. So yeah, yes, you can do all these kind of things in schema and get yourself listed and all this kind of stuff, but Google's not just going to take your word for it. You have to get other people talking about you too. And those kind of, it comes back to some really basic SEO stuff that we've all covered before, like link building, citations, mentions, context is a really big thing here. So
Well, what strikes me about all of that, and what the list I gave before, and Google My Business, so on and so forth, is actually, although it's not my website, it's all stuff that I can control. So it's actually not trustworthy at all, because I can add myself to Wikipedia, which is exactly what I did. Add myself to Wikidata, which is exactly what I did. I mean, I am notable, so I'm allowed to. But the crux of it all then is saying, where can we place information where we have no control that is trustworthy, so that Google can cross-check all this information that it knows we could put on ourselves, my business, my own website, Wikipedia, Wikidata, etc., etc. And the second question I have as well is that using Wikipedia, Wikidata was the old way of doing it. Now we have people like David Amerland and Gennaro who are in there because of their book writing. They're not in Wikipedia, but they're in Google Books. But Google is still kind of anchored to all this media stuff, films, TV, books, publishing, so on and so forth, and TV. At what point is it going to let go and start pushing out knowledge graph, pulling things into the knowledge graph that don't have that media aspect? Has anyone got an idea about that?
Yeah.
David.
Okay, it's a good question, and I think everything we've covered up to now is actually building up to it really nicely, and it does revolve around the trustworthiness of the information on the web. And essentially, a knowledge vault is supposed to address that by carrying out computations between knowledge graph and unstructured data across the web, trying to get to some sort of signal. What we want in search is to index the web like it would in one database and give us all the relevant answers in relation to everything that happens online. And it can't right now, because the 4 V's of data are so fluid and so complex that for something which is unstructured, that doesn't come from an already validated source, for Google to actually do that on the fly, it's next to impossible. At the moment, there are things which are happening in the background behind that. And here are the things which happen. The entity database gets built up year on year, and entities are trustworthy sources. The connections, the edges between these nodes in the graph are being calculated more precisely year on year. The computational power that Google needs goes up every year, and the cost goes down. And this is critical, because the amount of money that they spend doing this is also what allows them the ability to actually keep on doing it. So as we move forward, as they automate the process using better training sets for their machine learning, as the results get faster and faster, then we will get to the stage where, with certain precision, we will be able to get independent corroboration like we do in real life. You know, if you go into your neighborhood and say, who's the best musician in town, you go to Cambridge and you say, who's the best Cambridge SEO? Everybody will say Andrew, right? Well, in order for that to happen, Andrew has actually done a lot of work. He's networked, he's visible, his work is everywhere, and his customers talk about him. If we do the same on the web, at some point, this will start surfacing independently. It hasn't happened yet, but we can see that the pathways are there. You know, it's like, in some ways, it's like the same discussion that we had in 2012, where the semantic search results were very imprecise. And we actually, at the time, we're getting mixed results from the search, you know, from the old search where it was just links and semantic search related results, because the semantic search graph hadn't been populated yet. Once we get to the level that the knowledge vault is populated better, we'll see better results in terms of that. And the pathway is what we've just discussed now.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I do pull out of that is you're saying we should be networking more online with Google as the eternal listener, which is this kind of nice idea. I mean, Google watches us network, and it can see where all our connections are coming in, and the more you do that, the more you build up an image of yourself, which is the image that you deserve, because people who are networking with me, if I talk to you and you talk back to me, that gives this relationship, and it gives me this credibility because you're already very famous.
There's a really interesting thing there, Jason, about like what Google, you know, they killed Google Plus recently, but where they recently had, like, what a few of us remember is Google Circles. And that was like Google's attempt to get the social graph, right? Because then it knows that, okay, right, well, Jason, the SEO, is connected to David, the SEO, and is also connected to Andrew, the SEO. So probably this Simon Cox guy who comes in and is also talking in this group, chances are it's probably the SEO that's joined in this group, not the footballer. And it's starting to get those.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's valuable you just mentioned that, because in the very early days, I joined Google Plus on day 3. And within the first year, we're carrying out experiments because the results were beginning to show in search. And you could game at the time search quite well for a while by actually networking with the right people doing that. So, you know, if you sort of talk to people about search, you use specific keywords and so on and so on, it would actually show up in search really quickly. So Andrew's right on this, and you know, Google Plus has gone away. Yeah.
No, I think it was. Oh, excuse me. Hold on. I've got a technical issue. Keep talking, David.
Okay. Well, I was going to say Google Plus has gone away, but that doesn't mean that, you know, Google lost that signal. It doesn't mean that it's got a vacuum in its place. It simply has substituted that way of doing that within the parameters of Google Plus, which you control completely. Now it goes into the wider web, and it's, my guess, it's betting on algorithmic improvements to its machine learning function to actually deliver the results.
Yeah, thank you for filling in. Helping me out with my terrible technical issue. Right, now on to Andrea Volpini, who said, creating and managing machine-readable entity is a new way to content curation and to revitalize traditional backlinking. I really like the idea of revitalizing traditional backlinking. But more than anything, he sees it as a way of taking back control of our data. Then I talked to Doc Sheldon and David a couple of days ago. I've been talking to a lot of people to try and get some information about this. And Doc was talking about keeping in mind the concept of RDF triples, incorporate clarifying statements into reference content in a way that is supported by the markup. David said add a semantic layer, meaning and entity attribute relationships to take text, extract meaningful elements, rewrite those parts to leverage subject, predicate, object. David also suggested that you can actually employ somebody whose job is just to do that, is to bring out the semantic triples and reinsert them in a way that Google can easily read them. I would tend to say, let's keep the sentences short to make sure there's not so much fluff around it. And I was reading about Wavi, who were talking about identifying relationships between subjects, objects, or entities using verbs such as acquired, graduated from, is also of, is based in, studied at, and was and so on and so forth. So the question isn't that. That's my reading from the last couple of weeks. And this that Bill Slowski came up with, which is context clouds, which is a new, recent, patent for Google about identifying objects within a document, i.e. entities within a document, seeing what other entities are around it and trying to build those relationships to understand through the content, through context clouds. So exactly, I said content, I should have said context. Building an understanding of entities and relationships between them and even their attributes through the content text in which they are found, and building context clouds that can link things together. So, Sam, I've explained that incredibly badly. Could you explain semantic writing and context clouds in a way that everybody else will understand?
Sure. So, I mean, when it comes to kind of writing content for semantics, it's very different to on page as it was, 10 plus years ago, where it was, as kind of David kind of mentioned a bit earlier, where it was, you mentioned the same word over and over on keyword stuff until Google realized, oh yeah, you're actually talking about this topic. Nowadays, with things like the knowledge graph and knowledge vault, it's very much around, mentioning related entities. So if you're going to talk about, as my example earlier with Obama, they'd also expect you to say things like, President and America and maybe Washington and maybe Michelle Obama, because it's going to go, okay, I'm more confident now you're talking about Obama because you're talking about all these other things, not just because you've said the word 100 times in your text, like you used to do. So that's kind of where semantics is going, where it's very much like about mentioning of the terms, and great research, like, as you kind of mentioned, you're using the knowledge graph kind of API and pinging it to see relationships. It's using things like that to see what actually is it seeing as related kind of contextual content to an entity. Mm-hmm. There's other tools, probably not quite as good as knowledge graph. You can use like LSI graph. I've used the Write tool as well, which is pretty good for doing that, but it's kind of limited to what you actually put in. But yeah, it's quite interesting as well when you talk about semantics, and as we kind of touched on a bit earlier with the knowledge vault and how it's fact checking and how you can, with your kind of semantics, making sure you're using triples and saying the right thing as well. There was an interesting thing around how PageRank changes against what trustworthiness is of how many actual factually correct statements you're saying on your site versus page rank. It was, they're saying, high page rank sites, but like gossip sites, they had very low actual trust rank, which is what you'd kind of expect, where they weren't trustworthy sources in what they're actually saying. So when we're talking about semantics, make sure you're actually saying the correct thing as well.
Yeah, so I mean, it's building up the corpus of your site with semantic triples using entity related to entity, making sure that you're talking about related entities and attributes within the corpus of your text to create a context cloud, and make sure your sentences are using that. In fact, it's object, verb, subject. No, subject, verb, object that linguists use. And William Rock has just pointed out that Wavi was acquired by Google. I might be completely wrong about this because I got a bit confused after reading too many of Bill Slawski's articles, but that might have been the basis on which the context cloud has been built. I think David's about to tell me that's wrong. Please go ahead, David. Am I wrong?
No, I was going to say, no, Google is got a long history of acquiring technologies which it incorporates in its knowledge graph and its search algorithm. So this is probably a case in point.
Okay, yeah, great.
Can I just chip in on the topics thing, Jason?
Yep.
So it's following up on what Sam was saying, like that. I mean, as SEOs, we kind of forget sometimes that, we have all these tools, and Semrush is a great one, and you're trying to find those kind of related topics to talk about. And, that there are lots of ways to get that and to know the things you're supposed to cover. But again, Google itself is a really good source for this. Like, most people will probably be familiar with Google Trends. If you go in there and, mostly for us, we want to compare like, how does blue shoes versus red shoes trend over time? And you lose one of the key things which the trends thing has in there. If you just put one thing into the Google Trends graph and track it, it tells you what topics Google thinks is related to that. So just while Sam was talking, you stick in Barack Obama and it comes back and it tells you the topics it's looking for are Donald Trump, President, Michelle Obama, all the things that Sam was talking about. So Google will tell you what it thinks are the related topics around that kind of subject. And you can find those things. And if your piece doesn't have that, your bit of content doesn't have those things in there, then it's probably not authoritative and it's probably not going to rank very well.
Oh, great. Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I was talking to a client the other day, and basically, from what I understand, Google's NLP has been trained on Wikipedia. So logically, if you want Google to understand what you're talking about, you should be using vocabulary coming from the Wikipedia pages that relate to what you're writing about. But those Wikipedia pages are going to be pretty dry and boring, and the vocabulary doesn't correspond to what people are using, where Google Trends can come in handy, or Search Console, or Semrush, to pull in terms that are more interesting. So if you just want to be understood, Wikipedia vocabulary is going to help you. And if you want to use that as the basis to be understood, and once you're understood, then sell, you need to weave the Google Trends, the Semrush, the Search Console data in there.
And it's the next question stuff as well, because like, when you search for Barack Obama and you get the knowledge graph thing that comes up, again, Google's telling you what it thinks is important there and what it knows people are looking for next from that data set. It knows that you look for who is his wife. It knows you look for how tall is he. It knows you look for, was he the 44th or the 45th president? All that stuff is in the knowledge graph, but it's not standardized. If you search for like John Wayne, you get a list of all his movies. You search for David Beckham, people want to know what were his kids called again? I remember they've all got funny names, but what we're all, it doesn't have the same knowledge graph data for every single person. It's not a cookie cutter template. It's based on what people look for. So you can find all that stuff out. It's all in there.
Yeah, and I mean, you were saying in the process there are several questions, and you've got David Beckham, who are his kids, and the next one is, can I buy some David Beckham T-shirts? Which is where people can make money out of the knowledge graph. There you go. I've just solved everybody's money-making problems for the next 20 years. I was just another small little quote. I've left that as a slide. If anyone wants to really read it, I just like the idea that each context cloud, because I got a bit keen on that the last couple of days, I'm sorry. It can contain other objects and attributes of the objects, and they include structured data with known relationships, semi-structured data with estimated relationships, and unstructured data with unknown relationships beyond the frequency of co-occurrence. I really like that last phrase, because it is this idea of learning through known relationships, i.e. things that have been often manually curated, then semi-structured data where we can estimate relationships between entities, and the unknown ones, but we still have an idea, and we can guess that there is some kind of relationship through the frequency of co-occurrence. Anybody wants that, the slides will be available afterwards. We've had a couple of questions and we'll be coming back to them later on. But if anyone does want to ask a question, it's a really good time to ask it. Keep them coming. We're keen to answer anybody's questions, although we've only got 20 minutes left, so we're going to have to be pretty quick here. Here we've got a company, an operating system, and a person. Andrew, we're going to have to be quite quick, but can you just walk us through very quickly the specifics of different problems faced for companies, people, software, and products?
So key thing here is schema. So mark up all your stuff. You know, if you're just talking about your software, which is called, I don't know, double base kit, whatever, nobody knows what that is. So again, that kind of context thing is really important. What Google hates, and like all of us hate, is being wrong. So it doesn't want to give somebody an answer where it thinks like, yeah, and the stuff that Sam and David have been talking about, where it's kind of a fair degree of certainty, is not good enough. So you have to make it really clear what your stuff is. And the issue we have with lots of people, like, you know, when they, particularly now in the 21st century, you know, create companies and create software, they give them stupid names. It doesn't have that kind of Ron Seal test of just saying what it is. So you have something like, you know, purple flamingo or tangerine umbrella or whatever.
Or Wavi.
Or Wavi. What the hell is Wavi? Like, you know, out of context, it doesn't mean anything, right? So this whole thing, you know, as SEOs, we hear all this stuff all the time about content is king, and it's like, it's not. Content isn't king. Context is really, really important. So again, we've covered this kind of stuff. Like when you're talking about, I think Bill Slavsky uses this kind of stuff. You're talking about a horse. Is it one with 4 legs? Is it one that you jump on as a gymnast? Is it one that you use to, like, you know, balance your carpentry stuff? All that kind of stuff, all the surrounding content, all the citations you're getting, all the links, all that kind of stuff is really important. So it's looking to disambiguate.
Yeah, sorry, that's what you were talking about yesterday or the day before. We were talking the ambiguity of everything. I mean, companies tend not to be ambiguous, at least within their industry and within a country, because there are rules about sharing names. You're going to trademark your name, whereas people have this enormous problem with ambiguity, and I certainly have it. There's a footballer in South Africa, a dentist in America, a preacher in America, and a guy who's been in prison in America. There are loads of Jason Barnards around, so that ambiguity becomes a problem. But one thing you were saying was about barnacling.
Mm-hmm. So if you're not famous in your particular area, then you need to be mentioned where other people that are famous are. So let's say I was starting out as a double bass player, and I'm like, nobody's heard of me. How am I going to get into this world? Like Jason Barnard, he's a really famous double bass player, right? Where's he mentioned? How can I and it is that kind of piggybacking on those other people, because that's how Google gets the context. Andrew Cock Starkey, the double bass player, I don't know, he's just saying that, you know, it comes back to this. Google's not just going to take your word for it. But if he's mentioned in the context, in the same place that Jason Barnard's mentioned, oh, we know who he is. He's a named entity. He's a double bass player. He has all these kind of albums and all this kind of, it's that kind of barnacle thing. So hitching yourself onto those places. Where are the people that do what you do?
And or hitching yourself onto the double bass school you signed up for. It might be worth signing up for a double bass school, not because you actually bother going, but because it makes you look credible, because you're signed up to that school and you're an alumni of that school.
Yeah,
okay.
It's like classical barnacle SEO stuff. And again, you know, that sounds like a term that, you know, if you don't know what these things are, then, you know, but you can just Google it. But yeah, it's hooking onto people that are already doing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, with my clients, I'm looking at it and saying, okay, we can credibilize, we can get the EAT for the CEO and people who work within, or the board of directors or whatever, and that can help us push the company in, because the directors of the board directors, the board members are important, and vice versa. So this idea of saying, okay, I've got a company, I've got these people, I've got these products, I've got this software, take the one that you can leverage that as much as you can to get the other ones up there. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also something that will build and build and build and build.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the better it gets.
We talked about this the other day. I was lucky enough to have Marie Haynes come and speak at one of my events, and she and I were chatting afterwards. And, you know, she has this kind of theory that Google is doing a lot of work to devalue links. Like, you know, there's just too many links. And we've all had this kind of stuff in the past where, you know, you've had SEOs that just spam links into every directory. And that's not working anymore. That's because of the whole context thing, right? If you have 100 links in crappy directories, no good. If you have one link from that double base school, that's much more relevant and much more useful, and that kind of thing. So when Marie was talking about, you know, this kind of distance from trusted sources, so let's say Google has these 10 trusted sources, Wikipedia, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, whatever it is. How far away are you from those trusted sources? Are you linked to from the site that's linked to from the New York Times, or are you linked to from the site that's linked to this link? how far away are you from those trusted sources? And that's, like you say, that's how you get into those places. You might not be able to get yourself on the front page of the Huffington Post tomorrow, but can you get yourself on the front page of a site that's linked to the Huffington Post?
Or even get yourself mentioned in the same breath on the same page in the same sentence as somebody who works for the Huffington Post and has
Exactly.
the EAT
Getting in that context, in that little circle.
You're the best SEO in Cambridge, so you better get hold of the journalists at the Huffington Post. Moving on to the different knowledge graphs, everybody knows those logos. There's no need for me to name them all. But the question is, what about all these other knowledge graphs? They're obviously gunning for a place. Where are they all at, David? You told me a lot about this the other day.
Yeah, okay. I mean, everything is determined by data. Data is changed because of context. Everybody's building their own knowledge graph. If we look at Amazon, they've got their own knowledge graph, which is product related and purchaser revolving. If we look at Airbnb, they have their own. Facebook clearly have their own interrelationship graph. Google have their own in terms of how people use their data in terms of advertising. The question here is always, how do these relate to each other and what's going to happen next? It's a floating question because we don't know precisely, but this is how it's evolving at the moment. There is value in the connectivity of these data graphs. Obviously, Facebook is a walled garden, but everybody else at the moment tends to sort of exchange data to a certain degree. So data is portable in terms that it's transparent to search, and search becomes a unifying lattice work through which most of these things surface. If that value for particular companies stops being as valuable as it should be, and the classic example here is Amazon, if they feel that at some point they have sufficient knowledge about an individual to be able to pull you into their universe, and they're expanding it, you know, they have movies, they have music, they have books, they have other products, and they have also pushed out in the corporate world their Neptune database, which is essentially a database that allows companies to take their data and turn it into a knowledge graph. So if they manage to do that, then we might think, okay, why don't we wall off our information from Google? In which case we're going to get into a very fragmented web where we will have to leapfrog from silo to silo in order to get something done, and we might need separate IDs which are linked in some way in all this. But all this is happening against the backdrop of constant change in terms of privacy, in terms of legislative initiatives to address those issues. So it is also quite possible that we'll get to the stage where we control the central data or identity, and we have perhaps a web ID. It could be blockchain powered because there are a lot of initiatives on that front right now. There's certainly a lot of initiatives on that front for corporations, which are getting the legal entity identifier framework, which is called LEI. It's a non-profit blockchain-powered initiative, and it's only a small step to actually getting that to us as individuals. If we do that, if we get to that stage, then we control our data the same way that we control our personality in the real world. Companies will have to give us some kind of value for us then to part with our data, and then for them to actually use it in any way apart from what we want them to do so. So this is all. Yeah.
Taking back control of the data, it's something I've mentioned from Andre early on, but then you've also got this thing. I mean, from what my perspective, I'm incredibly interested in how to communicate the knowledge graph. So I encourage my clients to communicate with the knowledge graph, try and shove all this information into it. But in fact, what we're doing is throwing this information at Google, desperately hoping it's going to understand so that we can get this short-term value, and the long-term could be a complete disaster.
It could be. I mean, again, it comes down to how valuable something is and then what happens next. Certainly, Google has a lot of data on us, and it's incredibly valuable to the company. If that value then is abused in a way that legislative practices, legislative initiatives are put in place that prevent them from using it properly, then they basically kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and I don't think this is something that they want to do. So there's a dynamic there between what we lose, what we gain every time. At the moment, and I'll give the classic example here, actually, voice-activated assistants and like Google Home and Alexa and so on. Now, these are devices which we are aware that they listen in to us based on specific trigger words. We use them even though we don't trust them, and we're in a space which I call a trust truce, because essentially we use them because we get something done. And we're aware that they get some data, but we are aware that the data they get at the moment isn't something which is incredibly valuable to us, and it doesn't do any damage for us if they have it. If we get past that, then we'll need to rework the relationship and find different ways of working. And I think it's going to be the same with search in all its different formats. It's going to be the same with any other company that has data on us. We're going to get a certain dynamic where the control is either clearer or it's more based, is sort of more skewed to our favor.
Crumbs, brilliant stuff, wonderful. Going to have to move on. Linked Open Data Cloud. I found out about this a couple of weeks ago. Once again, I keep researching things and come up with all these things I've never heard of before, and they suddenly get really exciting for me. They've got 1,224 data sets in the Linked Open Data Cloud, 9 knowledge domains: geography, government, linguistics, life science, media, publications, social networking, user-generated, and cross-domain. The idea is all these knowledge graphs all linked together. Obviously with this problem that you just mentioned, which is the IDs don't match, so that you have to have this kind of portability between them, which isn't always the case. I was reading about Wikidata being particularly not very well structured in terms of RDFs and accessible from some, I can't remember who was complaining about it, but well done to them. Is this an opportunity? Can we just fill up the LOD?
Well, in theory, yeah. I mean, in theory, the original vision of semantic web, where everybody did their bit, literally, and invested themselves in putting data out there that was as clearly tagged and clearly marked and clearly structured as possible, because we all benefited. That should have worked in theory, and we know it doesn't, because the dynamic in real terms isn't right. The reward systems in our brains aren't activated, and we're unlikely to engage in that kind of behavior unless we personally self-gain something. So when it comes to this kind of approach, the question is potentially can, but who's going to gain, and how are we going to use it to game it in the first instance? It's reminiscent of directories in the beginning of the web, where people used to put in essentially in a loose taxonomy different sort of businesses, and you used to pop up in search, and then suddenly they got abused until they got deprecated and they weren't worth anything. So I think the way forward is through clear identification of data in terms of its provenance, and then clear structural data in terms of its value, which then will give it a value in terms of relevance once it's indexed and used in search. And it doesn't quite provide it here. It just provides a repository for data. It has a specific value right now because it is there, and the tendency is to use what we have. But moving forward, again, it's not good enough, and we need to do better.
Ooh, all right, then I'll tell Andrea. Sorry. What does the future of managing your knowledge graph entries look like? We'll go through this pretty quickly, so we've got some time for the questions we've got. Andrew, what do you think not managing our knowledge graph entries is going to look like in the future?
Oh, that's a big question. I think it's going to start to get. I'm worried about it, if I'm honest, Jason. I'm worried that Google is becoming just the source of truth for everything. So I worry that the short-term future is Google doing a lot more of this stuff, and people starting to get. So there was a thing in the press in the UK today about Netflix supposedly racially profiling people based on algorithms, and I think that kind of stuff is going to bring all these kind of algorithms a bit more into the sunlight a little bit. And yeah, I think short-term, my thoughts about the knowledge graph are slight concern.
All right, short-term, my thoughts is this is a lot of fun to play with. But I realise more and more that I'm playing with fire. But for the moment, I'm enjoying it, so I'll keep going. Sam, what do you think the future of managing our knowledge graph entries is going to look like?
Yeah, I think it's thinking of things like the knowledge vault and that kind of stuff. I think Google's probably going to be using that kind of stuff more to fill it as it gets better at understanding, whether something is a fact, and I think they're going to invest more heavily into that after all the controversy they've had over things like answer boxes not being, entirely true. I think that there's things I've read around using the knowledge graph more and using unstructured data, and how they're going to in the future, use even related facts. So if we go back to the bit about Obama I was talking about earlier, they'd look at, if someone said something, that incorrect about Obama, like there was obviously the thing about him being nationality being Kenyan. Them looking at things like related entities to a barman, like saying, oh, he's US president, and looking at US presidents and going, you know, US presidents are usually American, so we think that's false. So I think Google's going to get smarter, and it's going to be more automated. But then obviously using things like the Wikidata and Freebase to validate that, and that's going to carry on.
I mean, you touched on one point. I mean, from my point of view, I think you mentioned trust and confidence and credibility. I mean, my personal opinion, taking it that one step further, is if I can create myself to be the trusted source about myself, and I can build that confidence that Google is confident that I'm telling the truth, and I've always told the truth about myself, then I get more control over my own data, simply because these machines will tend to believe me through my historical truthfulness and giving the information and getting it qualified, corroborated and confirmed on a regular, ongoing basis. David, your last go at this one.
Okay, I think pretty much everything that is of value was covered up to here. I'm going to add a couple of things. You mentioned trust, okay, and we have to say, you know, it's one of those woolly things. We say, okay, I know it when I see it, but I don't know how to actually create it. And this isn't true. There is a granular approach to creating trust in terms of the content we create, the contact we have, and so on. And the 4 steps which give us that are contact, perception, assessment, and connection. And they're sort of linear in terms of how they evolve. And if we think about it in terms of, you know, whatever context we have in mind, in terms of search and the results it gives, in terms of the website and how the users who come to it behave and what they expect to see, in terms of the content we generate, in terms of our social media behavior and so on, it has to follow the kind of approach in order to actually generate trust. And then if we think of authority, that's even more complex, because it's made up of 7, I think, steps, where it's identity, conversations, sharing, presence, relationships, reputation, and groups/communities. And if we do all those things, then that's how we actually have authority. Expertise is easy to show. You know, you have content. Is it good or is it not? Does it answer the question or does it not? Does it have all the relevant links, all the relevant technical information, or does it not? That's actually easy to show. Yes, you're an expert, but are you an authority on the subject? And authority is cited by everybody, as opposed to, oh yeah, he knows his stuff, but nobody knows of him. So this is the kind of approach that actually is labor intensive. It needs a strategic approach in terms of how we go about it. And because it's the web, because it's digital, because nothing happens without any kind of intention, it has to be intentional. For the first time, we need to create those things in a very intentional, planned way, as opposed to how we do them in the real world.
Absolutely phenomenal. Brilliant. I was just thinking, sorry, I was half listening at the end because I was thinking I should have taken notes. And then I thought I can watch this back again in about an hour, so I'll be away.
I'm taking notes.
That explanation of EAT and philosophically how it's built up is brilliant. I also love the idea of it's incredibly labor intensive, and we don't have the choice, and investing time and resources into actually building our EAT, but also building truth about ourselves and feeding it to these knowledge graphs is something we cannot put to one side. I know a lot of people are, a lot of companies are saying, no, we'll leave that to later because we need those short-term gains, which is terribly foolish of them, and they should listen to me more. Position 0, we've got these 11 points here. We're going to make this really quick because I'd like to answer a couple of the questions we've got. I know that David had something to add, so David had something to add to that, which is why I did the slide back in. David, can you just add what you told me earlier on?
Yes. Well, essentially, position 0 will always come up from whatever format it's drawn from, based on relevance and trustworthiness. And we've seen how difficult it is to actually provide truly relevant content, and also content that's trustworthy or credible enough to actually surface in search with that kind of one answer kind of confidence behind it. So if we keep those 2 things in mind in the content that we create, which means that we have to be a little bit empathic in terms of the audience we're addressing, then we are on a fairly good path towards creating the kind of content that will appear there.
Super. Wonderful stuff. Great. That's it. Sorry, guys, you've got no time for the position 0. So I'm going to cut you out because I'd like to get the questions on. Thank you, Sam, Andrew, and David. That was absolutely brilliant. I know I wish I'd taken notes right from the beginning, but I didn't, and I'll have to watch it all back. Lots of really interesting insights, lots of great conversation, a couple of good jokes as well. Now we're coming to the questions from the audience. William Rock says, do you have tools that you can crawl your current site to see where you may be failing with context? Has anyone got an answer to that? A tool that can help him find context?
I actually chipped into the chat on that one as well.
Chipped into the chat?
Yeah, well,
that's a great phrase.
Without wanting to blow too much smoke at the key sponsors here, but Semrush do have some really good tools in this kind of content area. You can analyze the competitors who are ranking highly for the terms you're after. What is it that they've got? It will tell you, like, you know, have they got video content? What kind of keywords they're in, that kind of keyword density thing, which we've kind of poured cold water on a little bit. But, you know, those kind of co-occurring phrases, those kind of things, and you can start to pick out those kind of things. So even they've got a plugin for Chrome called SEO Quake, which I use quite a lot. It will start to pick out those kind of keyword density, like those co-occurring n-grams, like 2, 3, 4, 5 word phrases. So, you know, does it mention gymnastics horse? Does it mention, you know, doing a backflip? Does it make all those kind of things, and how often those words occur in bits of content? So you can pick out that kind of stuff. You know, who are the people that are currently ranking really well for this kind of stuff? What are the bits of content they've got? So yeah, there's tools in the Semrush suite that you can use to get you in that ballpark.
But not wishing to insult Semrush, they're missing the semantic triples, which is kind of what, from looking at the knowledge graph at least, that's what you really want. Actually getting a software that looks at those semantic triples. I mean, I've heard of Diffbot for actually looking at stuff. I don't know much about it. I think WordLift do something along those lines, but I've got a meeting with Gennaro tomorrow and he's going to explain it to me. And it looks to me like David's got his microphone not muted because he has something to say.
No, sorry, I just forgot to mute it.
Oh, right. Okay, do you know of any tools that can help with that, the semantic triples?
Some SMrush tools are used widely with some of the clients which I talk to, especially their SEO teams. Screaming Frog is used as well to sort of analyze websites in terms of the content, the links that they have. But the best, empirically, the best results were when we started structuring the website content into taxonomies and ontologies. And then just to sort of clarify that, taxonomies are sort of fixed and ontologies are sort of kind of dynamic and interlinked, and the meaning changes. So companies tend to, these days, produce a lot of content. Some of it is relevant to what they do and some of it isn't, but it's relevant to what the company is all about. And if you don't have a way of structuring that, if you just sort of throw it into your blog or put it in your PR section and it just kind of makes no sense, it only makes it that much harder for search to understand how to surface that content. So you're going into all that trouble, you're optimizing the hell out of it probably, you're writing it up and making sure it's as high quality as possible. And then you forget how it all fits into the other 1,000 pages your website has. And that's a cardinal sin in many ways, because it creates problems in how search will see your website, how your website then will be seen in terms of other websites, and so on. And I think that has to start from, you know, a conceptual approach to how do I create value with my content, and how that content then is structured in such a way that it becomes easier to understand what we do, the identity creation process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I agree also with William Rock. It'd be really nice to have a tool that pulls out all the context clouds and all the semantic triples that we're missing. But in fact, my personal experience has been, the more I understand about all this, which is relatively new for me still, the more I can look at things at website structure, at taxonomies, at ontologies, at text, and be able to bring them out myself and identify them. And when you look at it, it's not actually that complicated, you know, semantic triples, context clouds. As human beings, we're able to analyze and calculate those at phenomenally fast speed and incredibly accurately, as long as we have a bit of culture and a bit of intelligence. So my personal point of view is learn a lot about semantic triples, look into context clouds, look into site structure, taxonomies and ontologies, learn about it, because at the end of the day, perhaps we're going to be better at it than a machine when it's about our own product, our own products or our own company.
Yeah, I
might be overestimating my own intelligence. Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, I think that the point you're making there about subject, object, predicates that Sam covered earlier, that again, as SEOs, that kind of seems, yeah, we got that kind of thing. But I work at Cambridge is a really lovely multicultural city. I work with lots of non-natives, and they have learned English as non-natives, and their level of understanding of English is streets ahead of mine. I'm just a dumb native speaker. So people like you who are like multilingual, I dare say David probably speaks a language or 5. that kind of level of understanding of a language and how it works is really fundamental to how this stuff, because Google doesn't understand language. It's just a machine that's trying to read it and make assumptions based on the structure of sentences and all that kind of stuff. So if you're totally new at this, and all the kind of like, the triples and semantic triples we've been talking about is a bit like, what? I don't even understand what that means. Go and like Google that stuff. Start there. Start with subject, object, predicates, and work out what those things are and how your content talks about those things. That would be a really good place to start.
Yeah, I do agree that learning a second language really, really helps you get a grasp of your own language and understand where it's all coming from and how it's all built up. Sam, you wanted to add something there?
Yeah, I was just going to say it's quite interesting, kind of just on the back of what you said, is around, if you know a topic well anyway, and you're researching it yourself, and maybe even applying like journalistic principles to your content, you're actually researching topics well, you'd hope a lot of it would come out naturally anyway. But where it does fail, I like to kind of use things like the knowledge graph and just looking at Wikidata and stuff as a backup plan to making sure you have covered the topic. But I mean, if you're actually researching it, hopefully you do a lot of this stuff automatically anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if you research well, you should be writing pretty good content. And I like the idea of using Wikidata, Wikipedia, Google Trends, whatever, as a backup plan to make sure you haven't missed anything, or anything important at least. Very, very quickly to finish off, William Rock, once again, he just asked, there's so much data knocking around, where do we start? And I just wanted to answer that very quickly myself. You start with schema markup on your own site. You start with quality content on your page, which explains who you are, what you do, what you offer, and why you're the best. Why should somebody trust you? And coming back, one last thing about Marie Haynes, who's had too many mentions today, is she looked through the quality guidelines. Her EAT thing is her favorite topic, but she says very rightly that Google mention a lot in the quality guidelines, and they do say to somebody who's judging the quality, can you easily find out who it is who's responsible for the site and the content, and do you trust them? Have they given you a reason to trust them? So in fact, starting with that, build on your site what it is, what you offer, why should you trust me? Move forward from there. Thank you once again to you three. It's been really, really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sam, Andrew, David, thanks for coming along. Very quickly before we finish, next week we've got the last in the season, all about the knowledge graph. It's how does Google use the knowledge graph in its AI algorithm, and this is going to be astonishing because we've got Andrea, who I mentioned earlier on, we've got Cindy Crum, who I know is really smart, and Bill Slawski, who don't need to say anything more than that, do we now? So come along next Tuesday, same time, same place, for this incredibly interesting looking one, the knowledge graph in the AE algorithm. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, guys.
Take care.